Hello and welcome to the shed. In today's video I'm going to be going through the anatomy of the hand plane. Hope you enjoy. So what you can see here is I've actually got a Stanley Bailey hand plane, I have a Bedrock hand plane, I have a low angle hand plane, I have a transitional hand plane, and I have a wooden hand plane. So what I'm planning to do is go through all these hand planes you've seen down here, starting with the Stanley Bailey design, since that is probably the most common that most of you have, and we're going to look at some of the similarities and some of the differences with the anatomy and all the different parts of these hand planes. So let's jump down here and get started. The very first thing we want to look at is what's called the frog assembly. Now the frog assembly is the main part of the hand plane. It includes the blade, the chip breaker, the actual frog, and any of the attachments for operating the hand plane, and also the lever cap. That entire thing is all one. So if you undid the screws that hold that entire thing would come out as one part, and that's known as the frog assembly. Then you have the sole of the hand plane, or the casting, and then you have your tote or rear handle and knob or front handle. So let's have a look a little bit closer at the anatomy parts that we actually have within this frog assembly. So we have our lever cap. Not every plane design has this lever cap design. Some of them have this threaded design. This one's off my low angle hand plane here. It's very common on the low angles, and also a lot of the cheaper hand planes have this design because I think it's a little bit easier than the lever cap to make. So we'll have a little bit of a closer look at how this operates when we get to the low angle hand plane. But these operate the same. They have a lever, they apply pressure at the top, which cams off this screw here. So this screw cams off it by applying pressure here. It hits this, it cams, and it adds the pressure right down the bottom here, right along the bottom of your cap. So it adds pressure onto the blade to hold it right down where it needs to, so it doesn't move right at the bottom when you're hand planing the timber. You can adjust the tension by changing this screw here. And when it comes to these threaded designs, all that's required to adjust the pressure on these is just to do this up tighter. It's very simple. So then we come to the blade assembly. The blade assembly consists of three parts in most planes, especially if it's double iron planes. Some of the older planes did just have the single blade and no chip breaker. So what we have is the chip breaker retaining screw, which sits here, holding the chip breaker to the back of the blade. This is the back of the blade because it's a flat part. The bevel is always considered the top of the blade. So we have the blade, chip breaker, and the retaining screw. So with a closer look at the frog, as I mentioned before, we have the screw on the top that the lever cap acts on to hold the blade. We have our lateral adjustment lever here, for you guessed it, laterally adjusting the blade. When it sits in over the top like this, you swing it and it actually adjusts the whole thing. And we have the top of what is used for our depth adjustment and what's called a yoke. So let's have a look over the back. So we have our depth adjustment screw sitting on a depth adjustment thread to operate on what you can see here, which is the yoke. Now it's called a yoke because it comes from the ancient husbandry where they had a yoke branch like this, and that's what they called it, and that's why this is called a yoke. It's just to split. The animals used to have them around their neck as part of pulling and controlling and that sort of thing, and so that's why this piece is called the yoke. Now while we're on the back here, you'll also see this part. Now not all your hand planes are going to have this particular part here. This was added as they brought in the Bedrock. I believe it came from the Bedrock hand plane, and the whole idea of this was for adjusting the forwards and backwards movement of the frog once it was in here. So it would slot in like this, and so when you turn to this, it would bring it forward or backwards based on the little thread that's in the back here. And then we had where our frog attaches in here. So it rests on these flat bits of metal just here. The attachment point in here has changed over the years, and if you want to look back at my last video where I identified a couple of these planes, you'll see the difference between the two planes there, so I'll leave that video down below. So we have a few more terminologies when it comes to the sole of the actual hand plane. So the sole is referred to as the bottom, obviously that's what runs on your timber. These side parts are called wings, just like wings on a bird, I guess that's where it came from. When the frog is in place here, this is sort of considered the throat, because this rectangular opening here is known as the mouth. Just like humans, throat, mouth, that's where that came from. So we obviously looked at the tote and the knob before, but we didn't look at how they're attached, so let's just have a quick look at the parts involved here. So all of these sort of style designs, for the most part that I'm aware of, maybe some of the cheaper ones don't, have this little barrel nut because it's round, and it's held in on a threaded rod that goes in an angle here that we'll have a look at a second. And not every hand plane has this little screw here by the handle. Some of them have that to hold the handle in place, some of them don't. Some of them rely solely on this barrel nut and this rod here that sits in on an angle. So we can see we've got a threaded rod with the double thread on each side, and so when you put this in here and you do this nut up, it turns it down here and it can tighten both of them at the same time. Now let's just have a quick look at the front knob. It is pretty much identical, except we have just a smaller threaded rod and the barrel nut's the same size, and it just sits on a little threaded housing down in here. Now one thing to note, not every hand plane has this little raised section here. Some of the older ones don't. Pretty much from like, I think it's like 1910s sort of onwards, they start having raised parts here, and also a raised little ring around this front part here. They start to develop one of those later on as well. And so the whole idea is that this would sit in behind the frog, and so the lateral adjuster would clear the top of the tote. Now I just wanted to compare a few things with the Bedrock, because the systems are almost identical to the Baileys. So we're going to look down in here at the frog. So we can see, I can't use a screwdriver to undo them. So what we're going to do is have a look at how this is attached. So if I come in here, we've got two screws either side in the back, just here. So you see one there and one there. We're going to undo those. So what we have here holding this down is a pin with a little conical cutout. We've got a screw with a point on it, and the idea is that that comes in held at the right angle, and the tension pulls it down and holds the frog in place. The other thing you will notice here that's a little different is the attachment here. We've got this much bigger piece of milled steel. Got a couple of holes here because these pins have to disappear down in here when it's done up, instead of the threaded parts. So instead of these threaded parts, they just have holes, and so the threads come in at the exact correct angle in through the back here. So the first thing you'll notice here is how I mentioned that some of them have a screw detention on the top here, on their cap. So that's just got a screw machined through there that puts pressure on, as opposed to a lever cap like this that just clicks in place. Now, on these low angles, you can see that we don't actually have a frog assembly. There's nothing like this, no frog. The angle of this is milled into the base or the sole of the hand plane. So we have a much shorter blade compared to the much longer one of this. And these little machined holes are here to help with the adjuster to adjust the blade, and we'll get to that in a second. If you look down in this one, we have a screw here. Now this is fixed at the height for the thickness of the blade for this to sit in on top to tension. So this one actually doesn't move, it's kind of fixed. It doesn't really need to be adjusted on these, because the thickness of the blade is the thickness of the blade, and it doesn't really change enough that that ever needs to be adjusted. So you'll see we've got a similar machined part here as to what we had in the Bedrock system here. However, this is not a Bedrock, and this is not a mounting spot for a frog, as I already mentioned. What we have here is this machined out area, and we have what's called a Norris adjuster. Now this Norris adjuster is a very tiny example of the original Norris adjuster that was on what's called an infill plane. We're not really going to cover them today. That's something completely different that most people are not going to get, and they're not really made new these days, so we're not going to worry about that. But what we have is a larger threaded piece here with our nailed knob. We have this larger piece here, which attaches the Norris adjuster to the sole into that hole just there. And then we have this smaller part, and we get back to the blade. That little small part has a little machined part that sits in the hole. Some versions of this actually just have some slots on the back, and it's just got a slotted bit that binds with that, but the more modern way is this style, and that sort of chocks up and fits inside those holes. And so as we turn this, it turns this little front bit and moves our blade in and out. The other thing this little adjuster does here is it performs the same function as what we have here, our lateral adjuster. And you simply do that by adjusting the pressure when this is in here, the pressure on this screw. You need to loosen it off slightly, and you can simply rock it side to side. So just like on the Bailey and the Bedrock, we have a front knob and we have a rear tote. Now, what this plane has that no other plane has is the ability to open and close how wide the mouth is. So it's still the mouth. We still have a throat here, even though it's a lot smaller. And we have this little brass piece that you see here. Now, that is for adjusting our little mouth opening and closing. Now, we turn this knob, and I'll show you a little bit closer on this. This one is just got a little stub screw in the side to hold it. Some of them have a screw coming in through the top, which is more traditional. Just like our other knob here, most of them are done like this. So we loosen that, so we move this piece here, and we can see that plate opening and closing. Opening and closing the mouth, biting on my finger. So let's just have a quick look. Let's take that out. We obviously have a thread on the bottom of this, which is locking against this plate just here. This little plate, it's just a, oh, that's come off there, but that's just a little camming plate that rocks back and forwards here. So we have this little toe plate in here. There's the threaded piece that it was holding on to, and you can see that this is machined out for it to move back and forwards in here. So it's a nice tight fit here. Maybe a little too tight. And you can see that it slides back and forwards in here, lubricated by oil, and that's how we open and close the mouth. And then we just have the tote. This is attached identical to the other one, so no need to cover that. It's just a diagonal one, but you can see that there's no screw sitting in here. As I said, some of them don't have that. So there's a few things to go through in this. We obviously have our sole. It's wood. That's a little different. We're still using the same sort of terminology. We still have a front knob. We still have a rear tote. But we see that we have this metal part here. So the reason that we have this metal part is to allow the attachment of the frog down in this, and to just give it a bit of extra support and allow the ability to change out this sole if it does go wrong. So we have our lever cap like we did on the other one. We have our double blade assembly with our retaining screw just here. And we can see down in here that we do have a frog, but it's a little shorty. So let's undo these screws. Now, the main difference here is that these screws are actually wood screws. Because once we actually get this undone, we can see that they're a wood screw. A traditional old style wood screw. So we lift that out and we can see, so we had the metal here to keep the frog at the right height. That's part of the reason of this metal housing. And you can see that we've got these screws and they go down into the sole here. So we've got wood screws. Now if we look at our frog, it still operates the same, except half of it is the timber down here in the sole. And the other top part, so we can see, it's essentially sort of from there up. that part of the actual frog. So we still have our yoke here, we still have our depth adjustment here, we still have our lateral adjuster, we still have all of that part, we still have a retaining screw for putting pressure on with the lever cap. And we can see that all the parts are still there, it's just different because it's adjusted to fit in to this. Now everything else is pretty much the same with these. The tote screws into a metal threaded part back here in this metal part. This one's got a normal metal screw, so these are still the old style barrel screws. The whole thing still has the same terminology. We still have the throat down in here, we still have the mouth over here, we've still got the heel and toe of the hand plane, which I didn't mention before. Toe being like our foot, front, heel being like our heel, the back. So now we have, or are moving into the oldest style of hand plane, and that is the wooden hand plane. Called the wooden bodied hand plane these days because we've got metal ones, but this was just what was known as a hand plane. They were all timber. They were in designs like this. They had designs like this, which is a smoother design called a coffin shape or a coffin smoother. You have European designs that are more like this with this big horn handle, but wooden bodied hand plane nonetheless. You also have Japanese styles that were timber as well, and they're a little bit different. I don't currently have one of those, but yes, the way they operate are all the same. So unlike this hand plane's newer cousins, this sort of hand plane doesn't have a frog assembly at all. So we have on these toe, heel, sometimes step down. We have a rear tote normally glued in. This one has had a screw, but I've got it re-glued in. And we don't actually have a front knob. Most of them didn't. This one has a little bit of leather here, and this is what's known as a striking plate. Some of them actually have a metal screw here. Some of them have a little dowel sort of rounded there. Where our frog assembly would be, we have this piece here. A wedge. Now the wedge consists of a cutout for the screw, where the retaining screw comes in on the double bladed ones. So that's got to fit over the top here when it's down in the plane, and we'll explain what that does later in a minute. But we have these are called fingers. Just another note, if you are getting a wooden body plane, make sure these are not snapped off because it's integral in holding the blade in place. So in the absence of the frog, we have everything carved into the timber itself. We've got another slot here. That slot is for the screw on the back of the blade. So when our blade assembly is down in here, we can still adjust it up and down without it catching on that screw. Because if that was completely flat here, it'd just catch on the screw. Then we have what are known as the cheeks. Now the purpose of the cheeks, as you can see those fingers, they run down there, and these fingers run all the way down on top of the blade to wedge the blade up against these cheeks that you see here. So you can see that's how it's sitting down inside there. We have the wedge sitting on top, and you would tap it with a hammer to lock it in place, and that holds it with a wedging action. And it's these fingers sit on the top here all the way down there, so it's supporting the blade nearly the entire way down. Almost identical to how a modern lever cap comes in and applies pressure. We're just using the wedge to do that. And then we have what's called the abutments here, or I've heard some people call this side the abutment and this the escapement. I've just known them from where I've seen them as abutments. And the whole point of this, apart from everything else, once everything is down in here, it needs to have a spot for the shaving to go. And the shaving is going to curl out this way. So this is here to allow your shaving to come through. Similarly, on the bottom here, we've got another angle here. So it comes across there on a similar angle to the blade, and then we have this angle here, and that's to allow a shaving to run through and be thrown out in this forward direction so it doesn't jam and get stuck down here in the throat. So it's vital to the operation of these sort of hand planes. And then you'll just see that we have our normal mouth and our sole, and everything is just wood. Strike plate here is for using in the adjustment of this. I will do a video coming up soon on how we actually adjust these style of planes. The only thing missing that you would expect is the front knob here, and that's just held on the block in various ways instead of that. So there you have it, folks. That's the anatomy of the hand plane, whether it's a completely more modern metal style in Bailey, Bedrock or low angle, or even in the transitional or completely wooden. We can see that virtually the systems are very similar, but as we end up having more metal, we obviously need to have more parts and a few different names and things to make it all operate, because metal to metal doesn't work so well, whereas wood to wood is much easier to work with, especially with its wedging action. So if you like this video, please do like and subscribe down below. While you're down there, do sound off the comments. Is there something that I overlooked here or missed? Is there some other anatomy of some other style of plane that you would like me to do a video on? Do leave that down here, because I will definitely look at putting a video together for that. And if you'd like to see another great video such as this, do check out the video up here where I show you the difference between the Stanley, Bailey and the Bedrock hand planes. Bye for now.